this computer. There we go. Yeah.
Great. Well, welcome to OGHE's Global Health Forum. We have done this virtually today, but we really do look forward as soon as it's safe to be able to gather together personally. We will always have a virtual way of doing this going forward, but we're sticking with virtual this week. So today we have the great pleasure of having Dr. Moira Rogers be our speaker, who is new to UNC as our Assistant Director of the Office of Global Health Education. And she is passionate about developing and nurturing partnerships between the global North and the South, fostering narratives owned by local communities, and collaborating with diverse stakeholders. Moira is a first-generation Latina professional and committed to working with all those she supports, but particularly those from underserved backgrounds in this way. And her extensive teaching experience includes a program on disabilities in the global context, a course on opportunities and challenges for leaders in international education in the 21st century. Her role at CFHI, just before she came to us, she worked with partners in the Global South for global health leadership development with a focus on disability. So she's really perfect to move into this role. And I think we're really lucky to have scooped her up at UNC. So in her new role as Assistant Director, she works with our team, Sylvia, Justin, and I, with medical students and resident physicians on global health education programs. And I will say, I'm just like so grateful to have her as part of her team. Her maturity and really strong relational and administrative skills, and just her kindness in how she deals with everyone I've ever seen her interact with. So with that as an introduction, I'm gonna turn it over to Moira and put myself on mute and allow you to take the wheel.
Thank you so much, Martha, for the sweet, kind introduction. In 1916, the photo of a smiling young man in white tie and cap appeared in a report by the Committee on Cripples of the Welfare Federation of Cleveland. He had lost his job. Do you see the problem with him? Do you? What's the problem? Look closer. The young man had clubbed hands and feet. Cleveland's ugly law, later so-called ugly law, banned diseased, maimed, and deformed persons from appearing in public. Thus, they had him removed from public sight. The final episode of these so-called ugly laws was in 1974, when a policeman wanted to arrest a homeless man and combed the municipal code for a pretext. And then he found the ugly law and arrested the man and wrote him up for marks and scars on his body. Ugly laws were not just an abstract distinction. Definitions and penalties for unsightliness could take different forms for women and men, Italians and people of African descent, and so on. And they targeted the overlapping categories of the poor, the homeless, the vagrants, and those with visible disabilities, who a generation later would be subject to explicitly eugenic laws, such as sterilization laws. And like eugenic laws and policies, such laws continue to affect the lives of people with disability to this day. So according to Schweig, who wrote this book on the ugly laws. Fast forward to Bolivia, 100 years later, a group of disability activists marched from Cochabamba to La Paz in their wheelchairs, on foot, in an effort to speak with President Evo Morales about a disability stipend of 500 Bolivian pesos, or $70 in US terms. It didn't go well. The police, they were met with riot police and beatings. The police erected 3-meter-high barricades and stationed tanks and 400 police to stop the protesters in wheelchairs from entering the plaza. The Guardian has an excellent documentary that is about 30 minutes that I will invite you to watch later. So violent confrontations flared up between the police and demonstrators, including the use of pepper spray and water cannons. The government refused to discuss their request, so the protesters suspended themselves from the city's bridges in their wheelchairs. And you see that, oh, sorry about that. I had it off, sorry, apologize. In their wheelchairs. After 60 days of no action, they covered their clothing in trash and then they march against chanting, "We are disposable, we are trash." So when I think about global disability inclusion in today's world, whether it's at home or in the global south, in Latin America, where that's the area that I know best, I can help to feel great excitement about a lot of the progress that we have made. And yet I find it overwhelming to see the evidence of persisting exclusionary policies and practices. So I want to briefly invite you to discuss three areas. Where are we? What are some of these persisting barriers, persisting exclusionary barriers, disabling barriers? And then finish with some sites of hope and possibility, which I think is really important. So as you probably know, when we think about figures, there's about 1 billion people with disabilities in the US, and probably more. The numbers are constantly growing, populations are aging, and interestingly enough, medical technologies have created more disabilities because they were saving the lives of babies who may not survive, and that's the case in Bolivia that I will discuss shortly. And then with lack of care, they end up developing impairments that could have been prevented, right? And so 80% of people with disabilities are in the global south, many in conflict settings, and experience a range of barriers to education, healthcare, and other basic services. In many countries, they're subject to violence, discrimination. They're locked up in institutions, shackled, or cycled through the criminal justice system. In Latin America, if you happen to be a girl, indigenous, and Afro descendant, you get it pretty hard. So there are overlapping levels of discrimination that you will endure, and also structural barriers to a fulfilling life. I found a very interesting book that documents disability and poverty in the global south, that talks about the vicious circle of poverty and disability, and looks on the one side at the social, cultural, and political aspects of disability and poverty, but also at the strengths of people with disability. Most of the examples are for Africa and Asia, but they offer two scholars from Norway. They offer really interesting case studies, and the book is listed and available in our library. The other important piece on these topics has to do with disabilities in the global south, a book published in 2016 that lists what they consider not an exhaustive list of this health disparity. So people with disabilities in the global south tend to be targets of violence. What happened? Hold on, my PowerPoint stopped. Targets of violence. They have higher rates of non-intentional injuries. I don't know what I mean. Hold on one second. Yeah, non-intentional injury. They have greater risk of premature death, denial of healthcare, barriers to sexual and reproductive health, based on a myth that they are either A or hypersexual, and greater risk of HIV and infections and less access to care. So when we think about second important piece is to look at some of the important disability rights and global commitments that we have developed over the last 30 years, right? 1990, the ADA, I suppose many of you know, some of you are not North Americans, just 2 words. It was the collective efforts of decades of advocacy, partly by the disability rights movement, that aimed at signing a comprehensive disability rights legislation. And Bush signed it in 1990. And it stated that, people with all Americans with disabilities had a guaranteed unrestricted access to public buildings, equal opportunity in employment, access to government services, and healthcare. Whether that's the case, we can discuss later, right? But in 2006, the UN agreed to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This was a major effort, again, pushed by or mobilized by people with disability rights movements and organization, to take the whole notion that we need to stop looking at people with disability as objects of charity or medical treatment and social protection, and viewing them as subjects with rights who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions for themselves. So it was a major event that started being signed in 2007, and by October 2020, 182 nations have ratified this convention, including Bolivia. They probably forgot that day, right? Anyway. And then 2018, as you probably know, the millennial goals had ended up, had some significant advantages for developing and eradicating poverty and reducing maternal mortality, etc. But there was no mention of people with disabilities. And so in 2018, the UN signed or produced an agenda for SDGs and disabilities. And in this, they claim by, for, and with people with disabilities. And I listed it here, and I will get back to this in a little bit. So 15 years of the CRPD have passed, right? We're 8 years away of the development agenda, this SDGs development agenda, and claim nothing about us without us. But where are we? Have we really made all the progress that we need? So I want to, before I continue and talk about barriers, I want to tell you two stories, because to me, this is also a very personal experience, and one that took me quite a journey to understand and to grow and to develop, and also to be very humble about what I know and what I don't know and what I still need to learn. The first story that I want to tell you is the story of Hugo. You can barely see him because he's hiding under these beautiful colors here. But Hugo came to me when I was working at the University of Illinois and said to me, I'm Latino, poor, disabled, and I want to go on one of your programs. I was director of study abroad at the time. And I've been told that this is not for me. This is 2011. And I said, who told you that? And what is it that you need? So long story short, short story long, no, how will we say that? I mean, to a quick summary, we created a program called Enabled Abroad that gave him funding for his PA, for his travel and for his needs, but more importantly also set out to document and ensure that the sites that we called Illinois sites were truly accessible. And it was a really complex process that took much time and much resistance. And he did go to Nicaragua, to Costa Rica, and then on 2 further programs, and then decided, oh, if I can travel like this, I can continue my education. So he got a master's in higher ed education, and today is disability specialist at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and continues to promote the access to international education and to all possible rights, and is an amazing speaker. So that's a story that he taught me. I call him my power mentor. He taught me a lot about disability, what his needs and his abilities were, and what I could do to mobilize resources to create truly accessible programs. So that was an important chapter in my own life. The next brief chapter came at the University of Maryland. I took a job, again, as a director of international education. And a week into the job, I was invited to a meeting about a disability major they wanted to develop. And they said, could you create the global arm for these programs for us? And I said, oh, sure, sure I could. Anyway, so I set out to visit some of the locations that the university had partnerships with. And there I met Nati, whom you see there. Nati was born without legs, and that's her house. And created a program called Disabilities in the Global Context, and had a multidisciplinary course with designed and partially taught by a woman with disability, an Afro-American woman with disabilities, who was phenomenal. And then created internships in various countries, Ghana, Ecuador, and Peru for the first iteration, and there they went. But the highlight of any student going to Peru was a visit to Nati. She would make you a soup with the little she had and apologize that she didn't have money for meat, that the soup would not have any meat, you know. So it was an incredible way of learning about, you know, some of the structural and some of the realities of her life, with an incredibly generous spirit. So I like to see a world without barriers, and I'm sure you do too if you're here, but there are persisting disabling barriers to disability inclusion. And some of these are structural, Some of them are attitudinal, right? And the first one on the book for any thought and talk about disability exclusion is ableism. And I want to tell you a really interesting story. As I was researching for this talk, I found a curriculum by UCSF called a whole, it's an article, and then they make the curriculum accessible for anyone who wants to, call Disability and Ableism in Medicine, a curriculum for medical students. And in this curriculum, they call ableism a dominant worldview that can lead to bias. Anyway, so then there's another doctor who calls ableism the undiagnosed malady affecting medicine. You can read it for yourself. And then look at the social sciences and some of the disability studies, they will call it, it's a system of oppression. It's not just a way of seeing the world, it's a lot more complex than that. And a system for that needs to be dismantled, right? And so, of course, as you probably know, it values independence over interdependence. The norm is the physical ability, capability, able-bodiedness, and sees disabilities as deficits. Even in literature, even in some of the literature that I cite here, they say that the common narratives of people with disabilities in the US, people in their experience in healthcare, is that they have experienced discriminatory and dehumanizing healthcare, practices, and that is very troubling to them. So it makes them very, very reluctant to want to go back to a doctor. Plus the disparities that we already mentioned, right? So here in my crippling joke, the doctor asks another doctor, what do you think they want? And see their responses, right? To be treated with respect, information I can access, to be asked, to be included in the decisions, to make my own decisions, right? So briefly, the models of disability. The medical model sees the person as the problem. It's the physical impairment, the mental sensory impairment, right? And this has been the official model in many ways in medicine, right? And so the individual is impaired, is the problem, needs to be cured, needs to be fixed. The social model of disability says, actually, there's nothing wrong with the person. The world is disabling. So there are barriers that we have created that don't allow people with disability to be fully integrated. And these are environmental, attitudinal, organizational, right? And we'll talk more about these, right? And then an illustration of this, can't access the stairs, her impairment is the problem. They should give her prosthetics. The social model will say the stairs are the problem, they should build a ramp, right? I wanted to briefly also mention the charity model, because in a lot of the work that I've done in Latin America, I often hear people say, oh, those poor people, oh, pobrecitos, los chiquitos con Down syndrome, oh, pobrecito, those. So there, you still hear a lot of that. And so there's the idea that disability is a punishment or a tragedy, and if you receive punishment, you must have done something wrong. And there's a lot of, cultural folklore along those lines, and you find those a lot in rural areas. So then people with disabilities are unfortunate, helpless, they deserve pity, they can't contribute anything to society, and they need to be kept apart. And so if possible, we lock them up so we don't have to see them, and then problem solved. I will also say that in my experience, when somebody has a child with disability, with a severe disability, born with a severe disability, and you live in the higher Andes, often they're discarded. And it is the Catholic charities that pick them up, feed them, house them, and take care of them, right? So I want to be also mindful and careful that, of course, I don't see all people with disability as people deserving charity, but there's without these organizations, I don't know what a lot of people would not have lives today, right? And it's been really humbling and overwhelming to visit some of those centers. So the World Health Organization espouses the ICF, International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. And so it integrates the two major models of disability. It says we need to recognize the role of environmental factors, and at the same time, the relevance of associated health conditions and their effects. So let's talk a little bit about accessibility next. So one of the biggest challenges that disability inclusion faces in both here and in the global south is a data gap. I need to admit somebody. In 2020, there was an article in the Lancet that read, "Who counts depends on who is counted." And they said that this lack of disability tracking is not just a coincidence, but it is part of a larger, discrimination process that has not included people with disabilities, and calls on people to, reframe that, change that, right? And so, if we don't know who the people are, and we would not be able to make them part of any data strategies to make changes, right? I will say the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, also make a big effort, a big point on changing the way data are collected here. The next accessibility issue is one that is more commonly known, has to do with space, technology, and transportation. Let me show you a slide that summarizes that. See, here you see an example of how the Sustainable Development Goals set out some targets. For example, building disability-sensitive education facilities, provide accessible transport system, and provide accessible public and green spaces. And then it's clear that 52% of schools are not wheelchair accessible, 61% of government websites are not accessible, etc. And if you look at the data in terms of countries with accessibility guidelines, you will see the Americas, we get you down probably. I mean, the Americas in the South probably get that statistic percentage further down than it would be if it were only North America. Africa's at 48, and Europe is the gold standard in a way. Accessibility is a core issue when it comes to evacuation. And also the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities requires that states ensure facilities. Now the question is, going back to what we were talking earlier about the poverty trap, how can, I see it with my own eyes, how can schools and organizations such as, for example, in Oaxaca, that work with very poor children, how can they build accessible schools when the children themselves don't have access to electricity, and so they are doing online learning without Wi-Fi? So how can you do that? So it's a major setback in so many ways. So there are a lot of there are vicious circles in which one element reinforces the next, right? And so I encourage you to look at the book and see if it's information that you may find interesting. The other core area that has been pointed out has to do with the pandemic response, and I'm gonna get to I'm gonna do that next. Let me see. And so the COVID Disability Rights Monitor for 2020, or COVID DRM, says that the pandemic response has been catastrophic for people with disabilities. So look at the cartoon, it breaks my heart. Who's responsible for that? Do not resuscitate, right? I know it's tough, I know it's complex, but bottom line, states have failed to take sufficient measures to protect the rights of people with disabilities. Some have actively pursued policies which result in wide-scale violations. For example, freedom from torture, ill treatment, violence, abuse, independent living, etc. And then the result, enhanced institutionalization, breakdown of essential services, multiplication of intersectional harms, and denial of access to healthcare. So the recommendation, here's a quote from the report: the COVID-19 pandemic represents a threat to the lives of people with disabilities. COVID is hitting hard in our community, feeding on and deepening the historical and structural discrimination against people with disabilities. Governments across the world must act fast to guarantee that all COVID-19 responses are accessible and disability inclusive. So the recommendation, a quick summary: full participation of people with disabilities in health policy making, health policy making, access to health information, care and services, that for all people, and training of health professionals on the rights of people with disability and the impact that it has on healthcare. And I'm now going to go back because I now want to go to my last point that has to do with attitudinal barriers. I'm trying to go too fast now. I know some people will have to go. So some of the attitudinal barriers, stereotyping, stigma, implicit and explicit bias might be some of the hardest to shed or to change, in my view. So here is another cartoon. Come along now, one more label and you're ready to face the world. You're brave, you're a burden, you're tragic, you're pathetic, etc. You've probably heard that, right? But this is what many people with disabilities are faced with in their day-to-day lives. The Disability History Museum has some really good resources for talking about this and discussing this. And there's in particular this article about stereotypes about people with disabilities that I found interesting, that lists some of the main stereotypes. I'm not going to repeat them, but what I will say also is that the Harvard project on I forget the exact on let me see, I cannot see my own quote, on Project Implicit is what it's called, has an assessment tool on disability. And so, and I took it, and I consider myself, I like to consider myself as very aware and compassionate and blah, blah, right? Let me tell you, my score wasn't very encouraging. So I felt, I often use this image of the cat looking at herself in the mirror and seeing a lion. And so I thought, okay, this is really humbling, right? And there's a lot more that I need to learn, that I need to do, that I need to ask, that I need to explore to truly, be stereotype free, right? And so, and that's an invitation, I think, for all of us. And I wanted to mention too, this particular piece of the SDGs in which they said that one of the targets is to, eliminate discriminatory laws, policies, and practices concerning people with disabilities. And one of the core or the main causes of discrimination, according to them, is the lack of awareness about the needs and also, very importantly, about the abilities of persons with disabilities, right? Of course, there are laws, and of course, there are many people who have adopted constitutions to change that, but the change has not been fast, right? Or fast enough. So it's interesting to review some of the recommendations, and one of them is to raise awareness about persons with disability through public campaigns, et cetera, right? And then develop better mechanisms for reporting. Fast forward here, I'm going to skip this because I want to make sure that we have time for questions and for comments. So when I think about all of this, I want to share with you what I named, as I was thinking about all these sites of hope and possibility. I think you probably know the city of La Paz is built on the mountain, and on the valley you have the rich people, the business, etc. The higher you go, the poorer people are, and the most likely you will see indigenous communities. So this doctor, this is Dr. Cecilia Uribe, is an incredible, she takes her car and drives up the mountain and goes and sees people with disabilities, women, young girls who get pregnant, and does an amazing job at all of that. So it is following her and her personal medical practice is a very illuminating task for any medical student or person who wants to learn about the complexities of healthcare in such a setting. She also is part of or serves the needs of Catholic disability charities. So again, this is charity, yes. These are kids who have been discarded, right? And she partners with a doctor who has a program to train mothers when a baby is born and they hear that the baby has Down syndrome. They usually don't want them. They want to give him back, And so they've developed a program to train mothers and support them through, support groups, etc., so that they learn how a child with Down syndrome can have a sustainable happy life. So that's an amazing, they've had amazing success. This is all pre-COVID, right? Because they've been super, as you probably know, overwhelmed with now the fourth wave and a healthcare system that has collapsed. So, but the third area that she hopes to develop is preventing disability. So her husband is a neonatologist, and they see time and again babies that are born, that would never survive if it weren't for the technology, but then they're sent home with mothers who have no idea or no resources to know how to stimulate the baby or how to help them, develop in a healthy way. So they have this dream of creating a center for preventing disabilities. My next example of a site of hope is in the CRE, Center for Rehabilitation and Special Education in Oaxaca, Mexico. Oaxaca, you need to know, is one of the poorest states of Mexico, sometimes the poorest, sometimes the second poorest. And they have managed to create a lab for orthoses, orthetics, and prosthetics, And this doctor has an amazing vision for going out into the community and finding the people who could benefit from these and providing community care. So they not only create the prosthetics, like you see there, but they go out and visit the people, talk to them, teach them how to care for them, etc., etc. Offer transportation to the center so that they can come to appointments. And so they go out of their way to make sure that people succeed. It's not just the technology, right? And so I have had many students do rotations with him. Here's an example of student from MSU. And first, when you say to someone, would you like to do a rotation with a doctor that works on disabilities? Oh, no. Then they hear what the other students are learning and they say, oh, I want to go there. I want to learn. I want to see. This man engages not only the students, but every patient, every parent, every worker in a way that is truly transformational. So I am always really humble to hear and see what they come up with. In 2019, they were able to give 19 prosthetics to members of the community, the poorest people of Oaxaca. My next site comes from Argentina, and this is again one that I encounter in my personal travels, and they always somewhere somehow somebody connects me to really fascinating projects. And these kids, they're not kids, so that they call themselves los perejiles, which is interesting. Is it's the perejil? What's the word? Perejil is parsley, right? That's a very complex term in Latin America, but in any case, two of them had trained as bakers, and they wanted to work as bakers, but guess what? Nobody would hire them. So they said, we're going to create our own business. So they created a pizza party event. So they made the pizzas and they would go to the homes of people and make the pizza. And they made so much money that the parents kind of turned back and said, oh, if we continue to make so much money, they're going to lose their disability stipend. And they didn't like that, right? And so, but the question again was how to create sustainable employment for, in this case, groups of people with Down syndrome. They wanted to live independently, they wanted to continue to work, etc., etc. The other really important piece is that they were invited to every public event, for corporate training, for example, just to have a stand and make pizza. And they said their presence is the message. You are, working, showing what you can do and do in such a beautiful way, serving people what they love, pizza, and making a lot of money through that, So they were a really powerful message of inclusion in Buenos Aires. And my last example comes from Michigan, United States. And I learned with great excitement as I was preparing too, that there's a Doctors with Disability podcast that now has 40 chapters, 40 podcasts, or 40 stories, and a family medicine program called Disability that looks at how the field of medicine can include doctors with disabilities and accommodate their needs, their abilities, their contributions in so many amazing ways. So they have a really lovely newsletter that you can sign, you sign up for. And, even listening to the stories of some of these doctors is really, I mean, it's really eye-opening how sometimes things have changed as they became disabled, but sometimes it's people who were able to negotiate their ways into medical school, which is not so easy sometimes, right? And are now thriving in their practices because of this program. So Michigan has created the first course of an elective course that teaches, third and fourth year medical students best clinical practice in health, disability theory, law, and culture. And also, like good diversity workers, building a pipeline for disability leadership in medicine. So, and with that, I just want to say a few concluding thoughts or a few final thoughts, if I may. So, there's no inclusion without global disability inclusion. A lot of the talk about the diversity, equity, inclusion, and now we include action, doesn't explicitly include disability, and I hope we can change that. The next point is that cultural change is difficult, and we know that. I mean, I knew it very well from my own experience, and I know it from working in organizations, and I know it, so that, and nobody says it will be easy, but it requires intention, will, and shifting resources. And as I was writing this, and says, and yes, change is possible, right? We can change. Same, I would say, systems of oppression are hard to dismantle, but we can and should dismantle them, right? And so it's partly the work that we're committed to doing, And last but not least, partner with agents of hope and possibility, because you will learn and see things about yourself, and about the disability issues in whatever context you're in that you didn't know were possible. So I encourage you to consider that. And with that, I say thank you so much for coming and open it for conversation.
Thank you so much, Moira. Anyone who would like to offer a comment or a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and do so.
Sure. I'm going to grab my notebook. Yes, I'm listening.
I thought that was great, Moira. Thank you so much. I was just, what comes to mind, I think like when you think of working in global health, like you think of how can we serve folks that are more vulnerable in other parts of the world, and this quote's been like probably recycled so many times, but I think it was Gandhi that said like a society can be measured by how it treats its most vulnerable members, basically and so to me it's interesting, like as we are sort of promoting and sort of a global health educational office, and that's sort of what everyone here is interested in. I think that's really a great barometer of how we're how we focusing, where we're focusing our attention and our help and our sort of our involvement. And I think that this is great. This is it, because this is like, in a way it's more philosophical, because I mean, we have plenty of resources in this country, and yet that's an overlooked population. And so certainly in other countries where there's more scarce resources, that's it's the most overlooked. So I think it's such a great reminder of and a call, sort of a conviction to hear this. So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah.
Moira, this is Carl Bowes. That was a terrific presentation. I want to offer a little pessimism, and I'm sorry to do this, but what I see in our society, and increasingly in high-income countries, is this sort of rebellion against those that are different and those that have unusual needs, and you see this with racism. And I think what we're seeing, I'll say this at some risk, from the political right now, is a pushback from believing that the rights of all citizens need to be respected and supported financially. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a universal concept across the political spectrum. And I really worry that that attempts to expand this DEI concept to people with disabilities is really going to backfire. Not that we shouldn't do it, but and I worry in high income countries. I'm so pessimistic about the mood of the public now. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that and how one should react in this time when the rights of citizens of color or of different sexual persuasions are being trampled with impunity, quite honestly. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a really good point. And I think sometimes I refuse to focus on that, because if I focus on the pessimism and the realities of what you just mentioned, it's really hard to focus on the good things that we can do, right? And so in a way, sometimes that's a choice and doesn't eliminate the structural and, you know, some of the setbacks that we've seen, right? But at the same time, I think there are a lot of people who do care and who are committed to, you know, making a difference, you know. And I think we sadly, and especially in this country, after the years of government we had, I mean, people with disabilities suffer terribly in terms of access to resources, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very complex, I mean, I am sadly very aware of all of this, and I don't have an easy solution other than I want to band with those who want to make a difference, want to practice, you know, compassion, and want to make it happen, even if it's affecting 1, 2, 10, 50 people at the time, you know. If we all did that, then that multiplies in not in linear ways, you know. So it's not a very good answer. I know I don't have the full response to that, but I think the action that you can take is probably the best solution you can engage with in whatever way you can. And then if you can affect your institutions, and then if you can, you know, have an impact on the policies in your state, you know, I mean, it goes to asking what is mine to do in all this, you know, and what can I do? It's not a very good answer. I know it's not a full solution, but that's how I see it, you know. Because otherwise I want to shoot myself, honestly. I'm a pacifist, I wouldn't shoot myself, but I think it's just so hopeless, you know. It's hopeless. And we can just focus on hopelessness, or we can focus on the call to building a better world for all, right? And that's what I choose, you know, and the action that I can take.
So I have a comment. So some of you may know my youngest daughter has a coordination disorder and uses a walker. And she has spent, not in the last few years, but prior to that, she spent a lot of time with me in Nicaragua. And one thing that was really striking, so in Nicaragua, you know, the streets, the sidewalks, nothing is accessible.
Right.
And, you know, at one point she was like 10 years old and we're having to stick her in a jog stroller because there was just no way to walk around and, you know, get around with that walker. She would have fallen into the street. And then one trip we went down to Costa Rica, like as part of a family vacation at the end of one of my work trips. And it was so striking because in Costa Rica, they have more laws in place. They have like their version of the ADA. And it was, some of it was like not that helpful. Like there would be ramps that were like, I don't know, were very like homemade and probably would have caused her more harm to go down them. But just the thought, I mean, was so, made her feel better that like somebody's thinking about me. And, you know, there was small things that made her being there much easier. And they even have like I can't remember, some kind of rainforest park where it's like totally accessible, like the trails, everything is very accessible. So just like, you know, the difference was, you know, even small things can make a person feel invited. You know?
Right. Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah. That's a nice example.
I also wanted to ask about, there are physical disabilities, but then there are disabilities that we don't see. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, like, mental health, that's a huge problem for many of our students. It's not, perhaps not visible, but.
Right, of course, yes, learning disabilities, mental health. I mean, the pandemic apparently has exacerbated or increased, the mental health crisis worldwide. In Oaxaca, they've had to hire 5 therapists. They had a center for poor children, Centro de Esperanza Infant Center for the hope for children, right? And so they did, they helped them with schooling, and they found that with the decline in access to resources and lack of employment, et cetera, the kids are struggling so bad they had to bring on numerous therapists, right? And so even at the level of children, I mean, the implications of what we're going through are huge, right? And it's taking a toll on all of us. I am sick and tired of being locked down, right? I mean, and isolated and not able to connect with real humans, right? I only see the Trader Joe's people these days. When I go once a week, fully covered, right? What kind of a life is that, right? That's not the life I envisioned, right? But imagine other people in other contexts too. So I think all those issues are really important. I was aware of it, Sylvia, and I did not include it because I had to limit myself to 30 minutes, but I'm very aware of the need to include all these in any conversation on disability rights and advocacy. Even more so now during post-COVID, or if there's a post, right?
Laura, I have a question, and then I want to point out Peyton's question in the chat. It seems like there has been a relatively new language of neurodiversity applied to many situations of people with disabilities. And I'm wondering if you think that helps or hurts this cause. Does it sort of diminish what might be necessary to make different for those individuals, or is it actually helpful to mainline it in a way? And then Peyton is suggesting ways to connect and learn more about this. And you can answer that for sure in this moment, but I would also suggest that we, make that something that we build up our program around in the OGHE. So there's resources on our resources page if this is a particular interest. So.
Yeah, I will be honest with you, Martha. I don't know enough about the impact of this change in language on neurodiversity. I'm happy to look into it. I haven't yet. I just got back into this after some couple of years of not touching the issue. So I confess my ignorance on that. And
I wonder, Carl, would you have anything to say about that? Because you must deal with so many post-NICU babies with issues that are now sort of defined differently in school systems or whatever. Is that?
Yeah, I'm not, I'm going to beg off a little bit. I'm not an expert in follow-up. I keep track of the statistics, but I don't really Sylvia may understand better than I the challenges in the educational systems. It is a little worrisome in terms of numbers. The survival of the most vulnerable, tiniest babies is improving. Their percentage of disability, as best we know, is not changing much. It's not higher at the lower gestational ages. I mean, it is, but it's not dramatically higher with these very early survivors, but there are just more of them. So it's going to be a burden on the educational system and society in general. How we've redefined that and how we are accommodating that, I really can't speak with any level of expertise.
Well, one interesting thing is that there's always a push to mainstreaming. Everybody should be in the mainstream classroom, even if you don't know what's going on in that classroom. Right. And then you're like, the disabled child is like the one child with something wrong with them. And so you kind of, at least in my experience, you have to find community elsewhere where you're around, people with different disabilities. Like in Eva's case, she's been involved with this group called Bridge to Sports, where they have recumbent bikes for people with, physical disabilities. And there's the camp actually that Carl Bose's wife volunteers at as a nurse that kind of bring kids together so they have a community even when they're mainstreamed.
Yeah, Sylvia is referring to the Victory Junction camp, and I'm sure some of you may be aware of it, but it's an incredible place because it focuses on ability, and it clusters kids according to, they're medically fragile as well as disability children there, and they cluster them together according to their common underlying causes or needs. And so the focus is on their ability, not their disability. And my wife just absolutely loves it. And as soon as I figure out how to retire, I plan to be a part of that as well. But it's it's this focus on ability rather than disability. And these kids just thrive on it. And some of the things that they choose to do kind of terrify her with their wheelchairs on the sloped hills and so forth. But that the focus is on allowing them to reach their potential, and putting the infrastructure in place to allow them to do that. And it's really a whole different atmosphere. At least that's what she claims. That you would be able to speak to that, Sylvia. It's a marvelous place.
I would also mention a nonprofit in downtown Durham called Reality Ministries, where individuals with and without disabilities are partnered for community housing, outreach. And I interact with a lot of students from Duke who are part of that, who are the folks without disabilities, called Friends. And the amount that they learn from this and how it changes their lives is phenomenal. I mean, I think I want to learn more about the Michigan Med School experience, and just like earlier contact and integration with actually having relationships with folks with disabilities is so, so important. It's not a one-way street of serving. So,
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something really quick. Thank you for your talk. So I work over in UNC Global, and Sylvia, but both my parents are deaf, and I just think it's so. When I have traveled to other countries and I eventually will find a deaf person and start signing to them, although I know American Sign Language and they know a different sign language, you can usually make yourself understood. I mean, at least with some sort of rudimentary communication. And, I think the differences purely based on my own parents' location of birth, the luck of location, and they have like their master's degrees. I mean, I know everywhere else in the world, they would basically be beggars. And that's the only choice. I think, I mean, I would love to be hopeful, and I do agree with what Dr. Bose said. Like, there's so far to go. And I mean, the challenges are overwhelming. And I think even, in a place like the US where there's a lot of laws and there's a lot of education, it's just the way people with disabilities are just treated like they're not even in the room, that they don't exist, is such a big hurdle that I love that it's being discussed, and I love that this is a topic, but it's just such a difficult hurdle to overcome, because even when you have people that are well educated and come into a situation well armed, they get overlooked. And then you like look at the rest of the world, or even in Europe. I mean, the laws are just not even the same as they are in the US. There's no ADA, there's nothing. It's a large hill to climb, and I'm glad you're climbing it, and I'm in full support. But I share a little bit of Dr. Bose's dismay and how that's going to be overcome.
Now, Katie, you're also involved with like Club Foot, like a nonprofit that help with Club Foot. I don't know if you have any insights for that from that work, or.
I'd love to.
Yeah, I did. I worked for an organization called Miracle Feet that worked on Club Foot in kids, and I mean the stance of that organization was basically like, you fix the club foot and the child can go to school, because they wouldn't be welcome otherwise. And it's a very simple fix for like $500. And it's hard to get people, I think, especially in the US and I'm on the donation side, so I tend to think about it in those terms. It's hard to, I remember sitting in Palo Alto trying to convince a person that said, well, their foot's just a little turned in. Why is that a big deal? That would change, the entire course of your life, that you would be able to go to school, that you would have the access. It's very hard to get people to really look at it from a different lens and what that would mean for the rest of their lives and their abilities to get jobs. So.
Well, I have to say thank you for saying in that, Katie, despite your, sort of lifetime experience of growing up with parents with a disability. The fact that you're still engaged in all this is hopeful alone.
Well, I can't give up.
Right. Let's all not give up.
Yeah.
I'm going to draw us to a close. Thank you, Moira. It was a really good presentation and just lots of food for thought, and we definitely will follow this up. Next month, Dr. Cleo and Rubinos, two neurologists who are developing the UNC Peru Global Program, are going to speak about what they're up to. And if we can be live, we will. And if not, we'll follow up and just let you know it's virtual. And come see us. We've started to successfully get some travel exemptions for both residents and now medical students in places that are safe enough to do so. And look forward to getting out there again. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Maura.
And thank you for coming. Yes, thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.